Here's a list of things that I don't understand.
Let's do this.
How was bread made before we had temperature gauges and ovens?
The loaf of bread that we typically eat today wasn't the same as what people used to eat. The earliest forms of bread date back around 14,000 years ago, and they were flatbreads, which were cooked on flat, fire-heated stones or directly over hot coals and ash. As civilizations evolved, humans developed primitive baking chambers like clay cylindrical pots and domes that were made of mud, clay, or masonry. Since they had no thermometers, bakers relied on sensory feedback to determine if the oven was bready. One traditional method was throwing a handful of flour onto the oven floor. If it blackened immediately, then the oven was too hot. If it browned gradually, then it was closer to the right baking temperature. And some experienced bakers judged the heat by briefly holding a bare forearm near the oven opening.
Who decides the speed limits and why those increments? Why are we doing things in fives?
In the UK, they are even numbers that are rounded to the nearest 10. Standard statutory limits can't account for every unique curve and intersection and hill, so that's where engineers come in. They consider the road's design, operating speeds, visibility, crash history, and surrounding environment before recommending an appropriate speed limit. And then the transportation authorities have a legal mandate to decide specific limits that tailor the laws to the reality of the terrain. And speed limits are usually rounded to the nearest 5 or 10. That's simpler to sign, enforce, and remember.
I don't understand tipping at a drive-through or like a walk-up restaurant or like a food truck, because I feel like tipping is when you provide exceptional service.
Again, in the UK, we don't really have tipping culture. People can tip if they want to, but it's not widespread. And Europe does generally have a weaker tipping culture than in the US, although customs vary by country. But funnily enough, tipping wasn't originally an American practice, but an aristocratic custom that was brought from Europe in the mid-19th century to America. Then, following the emancipation of enslaved people, European-style tipping gained traction among American employers as business owners realized that they could hire newly freed black workers without paying them a standard wage. Under US federal law, employers do have to make up the difference if tips plus wages don't reach the minimum wage, but this does vary per state. And now tipping persists in the US mainly due to deeply entrenched cultural norms. In the UK, the minimum wage is £12.71 per hour for over 21s, which is around $17 per hour, while the minimum wage in the US is around $7 per hour. So regardless of the service performed, people in the service industries in the US need tips in order to attain a living wage.
Who do you call when someone dies at home?
Again, this varies per country. In the UK, if the death was expected, you call the person's doctor or NHS 111. If the death was unexpected, sudden or unexplained, then you call emergency services at 999. In the US, if the person was enrolled in a hospice program for an expected terminal condition, then your first call should be to the assigned hospice nurse or hospice agency. But if the death was unexpected, then you call 911, and then emergency responders assess the situation. They decide the appropriate medical or legal authority, depending on the state law, to formally certify the death. Hope that explanation didn't bore you to death. Keep asking questions and never stop learning.